Thank you very much, Tatiana, for that introduction and very much for having me here today. I'm really thrilled to be part of this broad-ranging conversation about American art in the 1940s. I join you with a background in history and American studies, and my particular interest is in the shifting role of art in American cultural and political life, sometimes broadly construed. But today I'd like to talk about a much more focused piece of this. My talk today will primarily concern a series of painting and sketches made by Anton Refrigier in 1945 under commission from Fortune magazine. Refrigier was an active participant in much of the artistic political agitation of the 1930s, from the John Reed School to the Artists' Congress and the WPA art projects. There was, to be sure, a contraction of opportunities for such artists after 1939. Mounting international tension and growing anti-communist sentiment put pressure on government patronage and other community-based art projects. But unlike government critics, corporations like Time Inc. seemed to be much more interested in finding connections between art and business than they were in worrying about the political affiliations of American artists. One of the things I'd like to suggest in this paper today is that for many artists whose careers spanned the tumultuous political decades of the interwar period and the aesthetic shift towards abstraction in the United States after World War II, we need to rethink the idea of modernism, not necessarily as a rejection of realism, but also of including elements of new ways of thinking about the nature of art, its audience, its forms, and its modes of transition. Others here know his work much better than I do, clearly, but I'd like to quote François Brunet, who wrote in his introduction to a volume of essays on circulation, sponsored by the Terra Foundation or published by the Terra Foundation in 2017, that, quote, modernism, or some of its currents, capitalized on mechanically produced and reproduced imagery from cinema, photography, and the illustrated press as a new condition of art, its making and its relationship to reality, space, and time. Furthermore, circulation, Brunet wrote, identifies a conceptual avenue for thinking about not just one facet or movement of American art, but its total historical condition as a site of evolving relations between things, images, and ideas. The career of Russian-born American painter Anton Refrigier is especially suited to investigating the evolving relations among things, images, and ideas, and of posing those connections in relation to situating so-called social content artists in the context of larger currents of modernism. Refrigier wasn't so much committed to a particular style, or even, though he was an avowed leftist and affiliated with the Communist Party in the United States, with a particular politics, but rather he was committed to an idea, the idea of art and society as intertwined, mutually constitutive, and necessarily codependent. Brunet's formulation posited circulation in the broadest possible sense, as not just about movement of objects or reproduction, but as, quote, spatial but also temporal, material as well as intellectual, international, intercultural, intermedial, always hinting at the possibility of circularity, end quote. Refrigier's understanding of his art, its function, and the impact it might have on both American and global cultures is very much in keeping with these ideas about the circulation of art and its attendant meaning. Anton Refrigier's artistic career is hard to encapsulate with just one label. Indeed, he consciously embraced different styles as he sought out projects in a range of media and for a diversity of sponsors. Although he worked sometimes in a straightforward fine art mode of easel painting and printmaking, Refrigier also designed theatrical sets, made illustrations for the new masses, planned the interior of a whole nightclub. These are images from the interior of the Café Society Uptown, which Refrigier planned out everything from the murals on the walls to the sculpture to the lighting to the color concept to the staff uniforms. He painted murals for public and private patrons. He designed tapestries and even ceramics. He embraced each project enthusiastically and with attention to the unique individual properties it posed. Recognizing that the diversity of his artistic expression was not without cost, Refrigier acknowledged, quote, I know that the wide range of my work is bad in a commercial sense. A stable, recognizable quality in an artist's work is his trademark, assuring the buyer of a well-known brand, end quote. Yet Refrigier's commitment to responding variably to the specific context in which different works would be received was part of a very deep social commitment. And I quote him again here, "The motivation in my work has always been my awareness, interest, and sympathy with the people. And I have set out for myself a long time ago to see ideas of significance and meaning." Art, Refrigier argued, was at its essence a language, a means of communication of ideas. That language, furthermore, had import. As he stated, in man's struggle toward the rational, the artist can play a large role, or he can contribute his share towards mysticism, can confuse and degrade. Links among art, ideas, and social impact are a familiar part of our understanding of Depression-era American art, but Refrigier wrote those words in 1951, and he continued to understand his artistic practice in relation to local and global politics. In his 2018 book, Facing the Abyss, American Literature and Culture in the 1940s, George Hutchinson writes, "It's difficult to resist the rhetorical drama of the revolutionary change, singular event or historical break around the date 1945. But he argues we need new ways of thinking about cultural transformation, ways less dependent on narratives of radical rupture." It's perhaps a simple point, but I invoke it here to underscore the complex webs of artistic activity, political commitment, and historical change that intersected in this period and that have been obscured by the teleological art historical narrative that was defined decades ago by Clement Greenberg and that has been difficult to decenter. To filter Refrigier's heterogeneous artistic practice in the 1940s through the lens of theories of transactionalism, as laid out by John Dewey and Arthur F. Bentley in 1949, helps to situate his individual practice, and in particular his social commitments, in the context of a broader mode of thought we can come to see as characteristic of the period. Dewey and Bentley's concept of transactionalism encourages us to evaluate human behavior through a relational lens, as organism-environment interactions that are mutually constitutive. This approach challenges predetermined notions of meaning. And I had the same quote that Tatiana shared with us earlier. I think it might be something that's easily digestible for art historians, but I'm going to read it to you again because I think that the ideas are interesting here. So, in Knowing in the Known, Dewey and Bentley define the transactional in relation to a lack of fixity in meaning. The transactional is in fact that point of view which systematically proceeds upon the ground that knowing is cooperative and as such is integral with communication. It demands that statements be made as descriptions of events in terms of durations in time and areas in space. It excludes assertions of fixity and attempts to impose them. It installs openness and flexibility in the very process of knowing. It treats knowledge itself as inquiry. I argue that Refrigier approached his work similarly, as reliant upon, responsive to, and constitutive of its environment. Whereas art history tends to draw strict lines between realism and abstraction as the defining characteristics in American art before and after 1945, Refrigier's practice was more complicated, and he carried both his social commitments and his sense of the role of art as participating in, shaping meanings as events unfolded, not simply responding to inexorable processes of global change. He carried those ideas into the 1940s and beyond. One additional idea I'd like to insert here, and I haven't quite worked it into my analysis, but I think it's relevant to today's conversations, is that as scholars, we tend to identify internationalism with the multiple currents of abstraction that surfaced in early 20th century art. Yet internationalism was a cornerstone of many different threads of American art production in the 1930s, and that carried well into the post-war period in many forms. It was in part his deep international sympathies that attracted Refrigier to the Fortune Commission and informed his sense of its importance. So, in 1945, Fortune magazine commissioned Refrigier to cover the United Nations Conference on International Organization, the UNCIO, in San Francisco. San Francisco is a theme here today. Although this story was planned well in advance, the staff scrambled to redesign much of the September 1945 edition after news broke of the atomic bombings in Japan. Editors informed Fortune's readers in the Fortune's Wheel introductory section to the issue that despite the advance planning normally necessary to develop an issue of the magazine, in this case, quote, pages were ripped from the presses, back-to-book sections opened up. Original plans for the cover were scrapped. The actual cover, which you see here on your left, by Peter Pining, who was the former art director of Fortune and then took on a sort of miscellaneous staff position. The cover, the editors wrote, was executed in exactly 4 hours and 30 minutes. 4 hours in argument as to what symbols to use, 30 minutes in actual application of brush to paper. In this context, Refrigier's UN artwork was all the more poignant. The UN conference was, by all accounts, a historic event comprised of delegates from 50 nations that ultimately resulted in the United Nations Charter. The event took place over 2 months, from the end of April to the end of June 1945, spilling out across the city. There were 850 delegates to the conference, including advisors and staff. The total attendance, official attendance, was 3,500 people. There were also more than 2,500 press, radio, and newsreel representatives and observers from other nonprofit organizations. Anton Refrigier, a leftist artist and frequent contributor to the New Masses magazine, had been an organizer of and recurrent participant in the wide variety of artistic and political activism in the 1930s. Yet despite these politics, he was charged by Fortune, a magazine which sought to be the voice and champion of the American corporate sector, with covering the event. He embraced the assignment as an opportunity not just to observe, but to participate in a definitive moment of world history. The portfolio produced by Fortune, and this is the first layout in that portfolio, conveyed Refrigier's populist interpretation of the event. His, quote, history on a sketch pad, as the magazine called it, placed diplomats and reporters side by side. The images highlighted a sense of the diverse participants who shaped the meaning of the UN conference, not just delegates and reporters, but onlookers and even support staff. The magazine might have expected illustrations of international leaders or momentous debates, what we might now call the great man version of history, but Refrigier's images, presented in a 6-page portfolio that included 13 sketches and 5 paintings reproduced in color, included more intimate, inclusive scenes. Fortune's text noticed that the artist had taken a brisk and far from gullible approach. The images featured Middle Eastern and Asian delegates, camera operators, caterers, ferry rides, even musicians who entertained the attendees. Fortune hired him to be an observer, but Refrigier understood the process of observing itself as a meaningful act, and one that was part of the overall shaping of the event that would determine Americans' understanding of it. I think there's a link here between what Dewey and Bentley understood as organism-environment interaction and Refrigier's interpretation of the contributing role of the artist as part of a new, more diverse, technologically enabled visual culture that emerged in the 20th century. A veteran of the Federal Art Project, Refrigier's mural for the WPA Pavilion at the 1939 World's Fair had emphasized cultural work as part and parcel of the labor needed to rebuild America during the Great Depression. This gives you a sense of scale. And here's the detail. Charged in that assignment with celebrating the achievements of the WPA, Refrigier's view of labor included this panel that depicted artists and bricklayers working in tandem to create a better America. In 1939, that cooperation was fueled by government patronage, but even after the demise of the federal art projects, Refrigier maintained this idea of art as contributing fundamentally to American identity and success. Similarly, when he received a commission from the Treasury Department section of Fine Arts to paint a mural in the Rincon Post Annex in San Francisco, and this was the largest single commission given under the Treasury Department's art program, these murals were completed between 1946 and 1948. In those murals, he sought to craft an inclusive past that would gesture towards a more diverse future. On the murals, on the Rincon project, he wrote, he did not want to paint the past as a romantic backdrop, but rather as part of the living present. His panels emphasized the role of labor in building the state, acknowledged ethnic tensions among workers, included episodes of labor conflict, and alluded to the exploitation of Native American laborers by missionaries. And I'll just give you a little bit of a flavor for those panels. This panel is called Beating the Chinese. And this panel referenced the 1934 waterfront strike in San Francisco, which prompted a general strike in that town. So Rivera saw artists as agents of historical change, participants, not just observers, and art as both responsive to and constitutive of American sense of their own national identity. He understood his artistic renderings of the UN conference as part of even shaping that conference's historical significance. And he articulated as much in his reflections later on about the Fortune Commission. What a great assignment, he wrote. Not only the assignment, but this was history. I wanted to be part of this history that belonged in my murals in the post office. I spent nearly 4 weeks there, packed with excitement. When I reported to the Time Life office, they suggested that I hang around the palace lobby and find something interesting to draw. I knew better. The Fortune press card was prestigious, and my drawings for new masses were of considerable help to me in many areas. I was in on all the conferences and activities that a newspaperman could possibly go on. I think the majority of people attending the conference had the feeling that they were at a moment of history that might be of work for peace. They were serious. The spread Fortune published a few months later, after the conference, respected his vision and reflected Riverier's expansive sense of the meaning that it held. For Rivera, the event had a global significance, not only or even primarily for world leaders, but for humanity in general. Accordingly, his drawings and paintings emphasized the character of the event and its full range of participants. That meaning was signified not only in the policies the delegates agreed on, but in the staging, the mix of people, the hype, and the media coverage of the event. Rivera understood that the meaning of the UN conference in San Francisco would ultimately unfold as a process, shaped by those who attended and reported on the event, as well as by the decision makers who were debating the character of post-war collaboration. The text of Fortune's article emphasized his approach. Mr. Rivera does furnish a strong sense of one quality that pervaded the whole affair and gave many observers as much hope as anything that transpired in the San Francisco Opera House. This was the unmistakable humanity of the proceedings. The magazine went on to note it was only too apparent that men, not heroes, were at work. Those men at work for Rivera included a wide range of participants and a sense of the deliberate attempts of all involved to emphasize their understanding of what was transpiring. Just to give you a sense of what the whole layout looked like, these are the interior pages with black and white sketches from his sketchbook. And then on the last spread, there were those sketches combined with the more fully realized images on the bottom in color. His approach was very different from that of William Groper, who covered the same event as a reporter for the New Masses magazine. Groper's cartoons gave a more satirical view. They emphasized the specific leaders and lampooned both political figureheads and the city of San Francisco itself. From the start of the Fortune portfolio, the text underscored the idea that this event was being explicitly staged. Quote, the State Department spent wads of money on theatrical decor, and the motion pictures of the signing have a strong savor of Cecil B. DeMille. But what most visitors will remember is not the golden velour columns representing the four freedoms, but the interminable common detail of common enough men trying to do one of the most difficult jobs in political history. The three images on the first page of the portfolio that accompanied this introductory text suggest that Rivera understood and chose to underscore both the visual symbolism that surrounded the event and the role of the media in shaping its reception. And so these three images, the first one, you can see those yellow velour columns in the background. It gives a grandiose view of the openings, but on the facing page, you have a closer-up image of those in attendance that included a very particular nod to international attendees. And as Dr. Whiting mentioned yesterday, we have to be attuned to the fine line between stereotype and internationalism. But in this case, I would argue that Refrigier's clear intention was towards the latter, that he was looking to signify diversity that was on explicit display at the conference. And then lastly, in the introduction to this event, is a close-up of the media men who were covering the event. And throughout these images, we see them playing an active role in the process. So his images equated three very different aspects of the conference: the official vision, the diverse individual perspective, and the important role played by the journalists in recording the event and communicating its significance to the public. And just to underscore the different way that Refrigier thought about the role of journalism and of the media people who shaped the nature of the event, on your left is an image by Groper, who is focusing, and you can see in the text that he's emphasizing Molotov, whereas the fortune text and the image itself really is about the press coverage of Molotov. And the text is not so much about what he said, but the fact that the press liked him. And so in this, another way that Refrigier is underscoring the shaping nature of the media in terms of determining what was happening there. Okay. In his text for the catalog that accompanied Refrigier's 1942 exhibition at the ACA Gallery in New York, Cook Glasgold argued that Refrigier's achievement as an artist lay in his complex approach to form and content. Refrigier's plastic technique, Glasgold wrote, had the authoritative touch of one whose art neither flounders on the shoals of formal experimentation nor stumbles on the boulders of stark literalism. It is this identification of form and content, and through this unity, the revelation of a human being sensitive to the deep meanings of life about him, that makes Refrigier so important to us. For Glasgold, like Refrigier, it was not enough for artists to be passive. Mere observation of environment is death, he wrote. Mere recording of the spectacle of man's activity, be it a prize fight, a burlesque show, a lynching, children at play, is death. Refrigier's images for Fortune sought to make an intervention in the magazine reader's understanding of the event itself, as one that not only happened and was important because of its having happened, but one that was shaped by those who planned, participated in, observed, and supported it. Refrigier believed strongly in the power of imagery, his and others, to shape understanding and ultimately action. And I know I'm running low on time, but I'll just give you a sense that his experience at the UN conference was also formative in later aspects of Refrigier's life. Images from the UN capped his history of San Francisco in the Rincon Annex. This is the last panel of that mural series. But it was part of a three-part triptych showing in graphic sort of rendering the violence of war on the one hand and American response to it. And originally that panel in the middle, which now represents the four freedoms, had included a portrait, a large portrait, which you see on your bottom left, of President FDR. That portrait was ultimately removed. He was forced to remove the portrait as the murals were being censored, and he recognized the removal of FDR as an attack on the specific meaning of the UN peace process. The attack is part of reaction's drive to destroy the significance of the 1945 UN conference in San Francisco, he wrote. And then lastly, this painting, The End of the Conference, was Refrigier's submission to the now infamous 1946 State Department-sponsored exhibition, Advancing American Art. That exhibition was ultimately recalled and the paintings sold at a discount to public institutions because of criticism of the government sponsoring communist artists. But as you see here, it's far from a sort of didactic leftist interpretation of the event in San Francisco, but rather encourages viewers to think about what the end of the conference meant for the global community. So I think I'll leave it at that, and thank you very much for listening.
Thank you so much. Any questions? So I'm actually a little bit confused. So why was Roosevelt's portrait censored? That doesn't seem to make much sense.
So the censoring, there are various lines of discussion about this, but the painting was finished in 1948, in the sort of rush of anti-communist feeling about these paintings, which overall were quite radical, the critique was that the inclusion of Roosevelt made it explicitly political. But Refrigier read it as a specific attack on Roosevelt's role in promoting a kind of global cooperationism after World War II. And by 1948, that was more controversial.
So the portrait was part of the last panel?
The middle panel.
Oh,
so do you see where now the family, the sort of multiracial
I
family
see.
is in the middle? Originally, that panel was essentially a monumental portrait of Roosevelt.
Thank you so much. I am fascinated to hear more about Refrigier because most people only write about those Rincon murals, and so it's great to have this broader view of his work. And many of the things that he said about, art can provide humanity against the rationalism of science remind me so much of Ben Shah's rhetoric during and after World War II. But I have. I don't know if it's a question or just a comment about his relationship to mass media and to print journalism, because he enters into a collaboration with Fortune, and so it's interesting to me that one of his first 3 images is about journalists and journalistic coverage of this event in a period when, of course, I think painters felt the pressure of the presence of the photograph, of the radio, the movies as means of communicating with the public. And sometimes that mass media was tainted because it was a means of kind of populist rhetoric during the war. And so I think that there's a lot, it interests me even that William Gropper is commenting on media. And so I guess it could be interesting to look at that relationship between print journalism and painting, and whether even in claiming things like a painting provides a humanist vision of the world or of global cooperation, that he's claiming something for painting over and above print journalism. And it also, I thought that the Hutchinson's book, which I just finished reading actually about a week ago, might be very useful too, because he's obviously trying to reclaim this term of humanism, which has been so debunked. And maybe, Refrigier, like Sean, is participating in that reclaiming of the human over and again, but through painting.
Yeah.
So that's a kind of rambling thought.
Well, there's a lot embedded in there, and to unpack this further, I think you're right to suggest that there's a very complicated relationship between fine arts and sort of mass media in this period. But I think that Refrigier and Ben Shahn, who worked for the OWI creating posters, they really understood in a way that Walter Benjamin understood the power of mass reproduction of images. And I think in some of these cooperations between these formerly, and consistently radical, politically radical artists and mass media was an attempt to shape what they felt could be a sort of opiate of the masses type thing. And part of what's interesting to me is why these corporate sponsors really didn't care about the political backgrounds of these artists. This is a cover Refrigier made for Fortune in 1950, depicting miners going down into a mine shaft. And he had made artwork about miners previously for the New Masses. And in tone, this is obviously more explicit, but it's not entirely different. And so I think that and then that's one other piece of this is that I think American artists were really turning towards corporate patronage as an answer to, and corporations were trying to claim for themselves, the role that the government had played in terms of fostering kind of a distinctively American art going into the post-war period. And a lot of the form that took was reproducing these things in magazines, but also, for example, Rivera participated in the Pepsi-Cola competition. He won a $100 award, and his artwork was reproduced on a Pepsi-Cola calendar. But there was a relationship between that and the kind of formal institutions of fine art. It had really been cultivated, I've written about this elsewhere, by Life magazine in the 30s. Those images that were reproduced in Life magazine then showed up at the Metropolitan Museum of Art as paintings in an exhibition. So I think whereas we think of fine art and popular culture as being sort of diametrically opposed categories, for both from the artist perspective and the corporate perspective, they were working it out. And it wasn't until, I don't think, really the 1960s that corporate patronage retreated into more of a supporting institutions like museum exhibitions and sponsoring American exhibitions of American artwork abroad. So in the 40s and 50s, I think this was very much more in flux.
Yeah, thank you for your talk. I wondered if you could frame Rivera a little more in relation to modernism, because to me the work doesn't look modernist. I mean, no artist of any persuasion is not influenced by European modernism on some level, but I'm wondering about how that art was read at the time. I mean, it was put in advancing American art, but a lot of those artists we would not today recognize as modernist, but as incorporating modernist elements. But in terms of the conjunction between modernism and abstraction, Rivera doesn't look like a modernist. So
yeah.
I wondered
So he worked in a number of stylistic modes. There was a heavy element of surrealism in a lot of Rivera's work, and sometimes that was foregrounded, like here. And Rivera saw surrealism as an aesthetic that was sort of light and airy. Not all surrealist artists would have agreed with that, but he commented on the surrealist nature of the murals in the Café Society as appropriate to that venue. And then some of his later paintings that he painted during World War II and in response to World War II also involved a certain surrealistic aspect to it. So just on a formal level, I think that there's a much more diversity to his practice than we typically associate with him, because as Dr. Whiting said, he's typically associated just with the Rincon murals. But even in his more realist artwork, I would say there are heavy undercurrents of influence coming especially out of German Expressionism, but also his use of symbolism. He did not think of himself as a social realist artist until in the later 1940s, abstraction as an aesthetic really began to take hold. So he was not involved in the controversies between, for example, Stuart Davis and Thomas Hart Benton in the 30s. He didn't see the necessity of choosing one over the other. And then part of what I'm trying to suggest, though, is that if we think about modernism as an approach to art, as much as a kind of a specific visual mode, then we can rethink the way that artists like Rivera and their artistic practice fit into this. And so that by embracing sort of modernist ideas about the mass and about the infusion of art and political resonance of it, I see that as a much more modern orientation than we have typically tried to see as part of modernism. And I know this is part of a much bigger conversation about what is the nature of modernism, and I'm kind of flitting lightly on the surface of that conversation, but I do think it's one that's just beginning and that we have to take seriously.
You talk about, you talk about what's, about the editors of Fortune not caring about any socialist or left-leaning artists, but maybe that's because they were so pro-business and so capitalistic, so obviously in other places that it didn't matter. I just wondered about the Fortune's particular context.
Yeah. So, well, I learned yesterday from Dr. Whiting that there were maps in this particular 1945 exhibition. But in general, from its inception in 1930, up through, and really my examination of the magazine went through 1955, when there was a celebration of 25 years in Fortune that they published a portfolio of their artwork. It was the artwork they produced was very heterogeneous, but also the work that they produced about American business was very heterogeneous, and they prided themselves on allowing in multiple voices. So there were some controversies over that, but James Agee and Archibald MacLeish both wrote for Fortune magazine at different times, and sort of surprisingly, there was a pretty wide diversity of views in that magazine. My argument is that Fortune did that in order to co-opt those views. So the magazine had quite an ongoing relationship, for example, with Diego Rivera. And Diego Rivera, they acknowledged to be this radical artist whose imagery was in fact radical. But when Fortune reproduced his artwork, they explained it through this depoliticized idea of humanism. So they sort of explained it as compatible within the larger context of what business was trying to do. And interestingly, I think Fortune was doing that in part to kind of show that business is compatible with any kind of thinking in American life. And they really used art both in Fortune, and Fortune was part of Time Inc., and Henry Luce had a very strong hand in all of these publications. And Fortune and Life magazines really worked in tandem to shape an idea of art and the corporate sponsorship of art and the integration of art in American business as being a logical and natural thing for the United States in the mid-century. And I think they did that in part to kind of counteract the government art projects. So that was started very early in the 1930s, and it went through the 1950s and really even later.
I have a question about how broadly Rifrigier's account of the UN conference was disseminated, and I'm asking this question here because the organizers of the Paris Climate Change Conference quite explicitly looked at the Copenhagen and other global conferences and felt that they were unsuccessful in part because of the lighting, the organization of the room, and of the menu. And they believed, accurately it turned out, that how the conference was planned might lead to a more successful outcome. And I'm wondering if Rifrigier's influence was felt in that planning enterprise.
No, he didn't have an influence in planning the event. And in fact, I didn't have a chance to talk about this very much, but part of what he was interested in was the way this event spilled out over the city, and the way that official people and non-official people were interacting with each other, what he called the red button and the blue button delegates and the red button pressmen. I haven't done that work to know how widely these images were circulated, or really how they compare to the sort of New York Times version or the San Francisco Chronicle version of this. But I think it's a good point.